So let's begin with a reading from Matthew 18. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and he begged him, Be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. What is your picture of God? How do you view him? How important is he to you? Such questions and the answers that we give are the foundations on which we build our lives. They influence the choices we make about absolutely everything. I mean, is God for you a distant figure up in the sky, watching from afar, but not really involved in our lives or in this world? Is he for you some kind of cosmic policeman checking up on us, watching out for mistakes? Or even a celestial judge weighing up our lives on his scales? Is he someone that we reel off a list of wishes to when we need something, but don't really involve him in our lives day to day? Well, we may have other things than those in mind. Hopefully something very different to those caricatures, because for Christians I'd hope that our central and guiding view of God is Jesus. Because for us, God is revealed supremely in the person of Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man, who died and rose again so that we can be reconciled to God and then so receive the gift of eternal life. For us, God is love. God is with us. God is for us. God is the God who gives and is exceedingly generous towards us in all sorts of ways. And if that is our view of God, then surely it must define who we are, because such a God will be central to everything in our lives. How we use our time and energies, how we use our talents and our financial resources will all be influenced by our relationship with him. Here's a quote from Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. He once wrote this: "What God gives is God. If we say that what God gives is life or being or goodness, then effectively what we're saying is that God gives God. After all, to put it rather crudely, what else has God got to give us than himself?" Williams goes on to suggest receiving the grace of God is like some little crevice halfway down Niagara Falls, receiving some water from the waterfall. Although receiving perhaps isn't quite adequate to that notion of being saturated and soaked by something that descends and passes on and draws us in. Now, there's not a great deal of point in the rocky crevice halfway down the waterfall saying, well, I'd like to hold on to some of this water. No, you really haven't got much choice, have you? It falls on you. It overflows and bounces off you, because that's what waterfalls do. In the same way, it's given to us to be givers, to pass on an intensity of outpouring. So everything we see, everything we have, absolutely everything, even each breath we breathe, has its beginning in God. If we take him seriously, then we'll want to respond to that. This week marks the beginning of our Stewardship Campaign at St David's Church. And it's a significant time for us, I think, because stewardship is all to do with how we use what we have, what's been entrusted to us. So our time, our talents, our money. Do we use those things just for our own desires, or do we offer them back to God to be used by him? Do we give him our first fruits, our best, or do we give him the time we have when we've done absolutely everything else that we want to do? Do we give him the loose change when we've spent all that we want to? These are the kind of questions that are good to ask ourselves when we think about stewardship. And maybe when we say that the root of all proper thinking about stewardship and Christian giving lies in gratitude, which is absolutely right, I think, and central, we ought to bear in mind that gratitude itself is not the same thing as a sense of obligation. It's actually much more freeing. It's much bigger than that. Because real gratitude, which is joy and delight, has very little to do with calculating what we owe. It, as Rowan Williams says, it should just flow out of us as the water does from that crevice at Niagara Falls. Let me read you a quote from the writer G.K. Chesterton, which you might find helpful. You say grace before meals, all right, but I say grace before the concert and the opera, and grace before the play and pantomime, and grace before I open a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing. And I say grace before I dip the pen in the ink. So like all aspects of our discipleship, many Christians find that we're on a journey in relation to generosity and giving and thankfulness. Each of us has an individual story shaped by our lives, by our experiences, and each of us has different current circumstances, don't we? So it's really not about comparing ourselves to other people. No, it's about being honest about our circumstances and responding to God as generously as we can in response to his generosity. So reflecting on our attitudes to giving, on how we use our time, our talents, our money, can help us understand where we are on this journey and what might be holding us back from moving forwards. Now, the parable that Jesus tells in the gospel reading I've just read can, I think, take us a bit deeper, and very helpfully so, into all of this. The reading starts with Jesus' answer to a question from Peter about the limits of forgiveness. Peter wants to put a limiting figure on it, but not Jesus. Not 7 times, not even 70 times, but 77. He essentially says, look, there is no limit to how much you must forgive. So look, in the parable we have someone who owes a quite ridiculous amount of money to the king, and there's a debt. And that debt could never be paid. So the offer to repay it is entirely inadequate to the debt incurred. The servant asks for time, and what he encounters is grace and mercy. The debt is cancelled. He and his family are set free. The key word here is grace, which in this context means forgiveness, and it means release from an unpayable debt. Now that's the heart of the gospel, isn't it? God offers freedom from everything which weighs us down, from everything which threatens to control us. And then with that release should come both freedom and joy. But an encounter with grace here seems to bring a corresponding obligation. The heart of the parable is actually verse 33. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? In other words, if you've been given much, forgiveness, money, talents, whatever it may be, what you have received should then overflow to others. It's not something, to hide away and keep to ourselves. So the obligation of grace is somewhat made clear at this point. It's not an attempt to repay an impossible debt. It's to extend that same forgiving, releasing grace to others. We aren't invited to compensate in arrears for grace by giving something back, but to embrace that grace that freed us and then extend it to others. But here in this parable, this grace isn't extended, and a second servant with much more minor debt is in prison. Now that's despite a plea for mercy, the wording of which is identical to the request for time to pay made by the first debtor in the story. So again, the plea is for time to pay again. Again, the need is for forgiveness and for release. The second debt, as we've seen, is significantly less than the first. Perhaps it's meant to be a manageable debt. Time indeed is all that is needed to pay off the debt, but even then this grace is denied by the unforgiving servant, by the first servant who had been forgiven much. More likely, this much smaller debt is still well beyond, though, the capacity of the second servant to pay it. But the big issue here for Jesus is not the capacity or desire to repay. No, it's the heart of that first servant. If we don't believe that we're truly debtors, if we don't believe that ultimately we owe everything to God, then we just can't grasp the gift of grace for ourselves. We can't extend that grace to other people. That's no different from Jesus' teaching in the Lord's Prayer, that the forgiveness of our own sins is in some manner related to our willingness to forgive others. In other words, that grace overflowing from what we've received. It's not a threat. Jesus is simply saying that that's how grace works. It's also true of the totality of our discipleship, our treasure no less than our time and our talents. The challenge is, are we truly sharing from what we've been given, or are we receiving much and retaining it all for ourselves? In the parable, is the first servant protecting himself from further debt by calling in his assets? Or is it that deep down he doesn't really believe he's a debtor? This illusion of self-sufficiency, the feeling that we're in charge, is a really poor conductor of grace. In fact, it robs grace of all of its power. The economics of grace, of God's undeserved love towards us, you see, is cyclical. In extending grace to others, there's the promise of a blessing. In other words, of a deeper experience of the saving and renewing love and grace of God. By contrast, there's a judgment on those who won't extend that grace to other people. It's not a vindictive punishment for not acting well. It's the retention of the debt incurred. The experience of grace then should result in the extension of grace. Grace not extended is grace not received. The reality of unpayable debt and the gospel promise of gracious release from debt illustrates that need to receive and then to extend forgiveness. Now, for the Pharisees in the first century, forgiving 3 times was sufficient. Peter's offer of 7 times was born of a glimpse of grace, but even that was inadequate. Jesus calls Peter to forgive 70 times, or even 70 times 7. Peter was proposing a rich and generous rule, but Jesus called him beyond that, to the extravagance of grace. To be true to grace, then, we need to move beyond the question, how much should I give back to God? I think we need to ask a deeper question. Does my giving, both in my time and in my financial terms, really reflect who I am and what I have received from God? Now, in practical terms, it might well help to begin by asking what proportion of my income, what proportion of the time I have each week should I be giving to God? Well, of course, we serve God in many ways. But depending on our current circumstances, our answers are going to be different. It really is between us and God. Now, everyone in the church family will have received a pack, and if you haven't, it's available for you in church now. And we want you to use that pack to respond in a way that's right for you. Now, I will know how you respond to questions about things you might do in the life of the church, but I will never know how much people give financially. The only person who ever knows that is our treasurer. I never have anything to do with that side of things. But one of the new things we're offering is something called the Parish Giving Scheme, and in the pack it explains this. This is a Church of England scheme which is completely free to us. We give to St David's via the scheme. They collect the gift aid automatically and then send us every penny of that back to us. That way no one here in the church has any idea how much individuals are giving, and it makes our administration so much easier. Both myself and the PCC are taking the lead by all signing up to this. There's also a leaflet in the pack which explains how much it costs to run the church, and a leaflet where we can indicate our responses. And of course, just as important, there's a sheet which helps us explore what our talents are and how, again, given our own circumstances, what time we can offer to God. So there are packs in the church building for everyone. If you haven't got one yet, do pick it up soon. There's also a resource to help you reflect over the next few weeks. This is 8 videos and 8 short studies. Everyone will get 2 emails each week with links in. If you're not on the church email list, then just let me know and we'll make sure we get those out to you. So let's spend the next few weeks, shall we, reflecting on God's generosity towards us and our gifts and talents, our available time and our finances. Let's remember that all we have ultimately comes from God, and let's remember his outpouring of grace upon us all, and then let each one of us respond to God as he guides us at this point in time.